malicious. Like he stole some data or something from their machine.
Right.
Then of course
That's more
Data
clear-cut.
Protection Act and all that sort of stuff comes in then, doesn't it?
Yeah. It doesn't. Once you've done that, it's kind of doesn't matter how you did it. You've done that, and therefore, gotcha.
Will you get this thing up there?
Okay. Yep.
Oh, no, I'll do it now. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This session is the session on protecting the users. Can I remind you, and I'll have the slide up at the end again of the BOF sessions afterwards, and the hot dog stand as well. That's selling hot dogs for people that are staying. Right, as I say, we've got three speakers on security. We're starting off with Sarah McEnany from Trinity College Dublin, who's going to talk about who is the IT security officer in Trinity, and we'll be talking on policies. Sarah, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Mike said, I'm going to be talking about security policies, and in particular about their application to the campus network. So when you try to implement a policy, what are the difficulties that you encounter that are specific to the campus network? So I'll go through how you would create a policy, and then all the various steps towards implementation, and looking then at the factors that make the campus environment different. And this is very much from our experience. I'm, as Mike said, the IT security officer. So this is very much my role. I was responsible for creating the policy, and since then I'm responsible for implementing it. So we'll go through our experiences and what I think are the solutions, the helpful things to do when implementing your policy. So before we start, I just thought we'd have a quick look at campus networks in general and their history in regards to security. So initially, when security started to emerge as a field of concern or study, there was a kind of a resistance in campus networks. The security policy and legislation started to emerge really in highly regulated areas, government areas, corporate networks, and there was a sense that that didn't really fit with the campus network, because the campus network was seen as being concerned with open and free access to information. And the campus networks as well had sort of emerged from the research networks in an organic sort of a way. They had kind of grown and taken on production kind of features as well. But gradually then, it didn't seem to be going away as campus people, kept hearing about these IT security standards and policies, going to conferences, people were still talking about it. So gradually a kind of acceptance filtered through, and people thought, well, maybe we do need to do something about this. But in my experience, even though they thought that, they didn't really actually do very much until later on, when really they couldn't ignore it anymore. So around 2002, 2003, when suddenly campus networks were experiencing disruption, viruses, worms, and when you think about it, the campus network was particularly vulnerable to worms because the open, flat nature of it, all the devices all together, meant that if a worm infiltrated your network, you had very few control points to actually stop it. So that, in conjunction with other, security incidents, CERT teams were giving universities reports that some of their rather loosely administered servers were being compromised on the internet, and then because of their great bandwidth being used then to perform other tasks on the internet that they weren't intended to. So really at that stage then, the campus networks entered a period of rapid catch-up. So they said, okay, we've got to get a policy, we've got to get a framework, and we've got to then identify the controls that we need, controls that really make a difference for us, and stop all these interruptions to our service. And hopefully then, I would like to think that our network is entering a stage of some sort of maturity, and I'm sure many other networks would like to think that too. And this is just some statistics from ECAR, which is a a research body related to EDUCAUSE, and they did a survey of about 500 US networks asking them, what policies have you implemented? And I think it's quite significant that you can see there 97% said that they had implemented the main policies, email, internet, and you can see quite high statistics for other policies as well. We don't really have this kind of information about European campus networks at the minute, but I would hope if we did that it would show something similar. So how do you go about creating a policy? Well, there's plenty of information out there about creating a policy. The kind of prescribed way would be to start with the standard, and the ISO standard is a very good framework. It lays out all the areas really that you need to cover in your policy and that you need to translate then into more sort of operational procedures. You also need then to look at the relevant legislation in your area, in your constituency, data protection, freedom of information, and work that in somehow. And then the received wisdom would say that you should look at your organizational environment, and this really is where the difficulties come in the campus network, but we'll come back to that later. And you want to identify your assets, so how can you set about protecting your organization if you don't really know where the high value assets, the most important ones are, so you want to identify those in some way. And there are loads of resources out there to help people create policies. USISA, a UK organisation, have created a great toolkit if anyone's interested in looking at it. And it provides a great framework, helping people see what policies they should have, how they should lay them out, and giving tips on what should be included in them. And I would recommend looking at that. So then you will end up then with a main policy, a kind of an overall policy, which states your organisation's approach to security, roles and responsibilities, how you intend to deal with incidents. And then beneath that then you will emerge more supporting policies. And these are policies that veer more into the operational procedural area, dealing with sort of either specific technologies or specific areas. And what you would hope to end up with then is something like this. And this is a screenshot from my website, which shows our overall policy. And you can see then down the side we have other related policies for people to go off and reference. The policy statement itself is probably quite long-winded, but I think when people see the links down the side, they can quite quickly jump to what concerns them. You can see that it was approved initially in 2003, and we try to update it regularly, keep up with any developments. It was updated earlier this year. So you've got your policy, what do you do next, okay? So again, the received wisdom would be you go to your governing body and you get them to approve it, so you get them to okay it. And then you come up with a plan to communicate it to your users. So you want to identify your users, and there's loads of ways to communicate it to users. There's loads of information about how to run good awareness schemes, how to get people to sign up effectively to policies. And you then want to translate your policies into more operational procedures so that your IT department and other areas can say, well, what does this mean for us in developing systems, in managing systems, what should we be doing? And then you want to think about how you're going to deal with enforcement and how you're going to ensure compliance. You're going to have audits, reviews, how are you going to do it? So when you've reached the stage then with the campus, you say, well, how am I going? You get to your point where you're looking at your implementation plan, and these, I think, are the difficulties that come up. So as you mentioned before, there immediately seems a bit of a conflict between what the organization is trying to do. So you've got this rigid policy and guidelines, and then on the other hand you have this open ethos, where you want to provide access to information and you want to facilitate people in what they're trying to do. Also, you have a hugely diverse user base. It's a really heterogeneous network. You've got admin people teaching research activities, grids, commerce, you can read the rest of them, and increasingly you've got students on the network. You've got somehow to accommodate guests and members of the public who come onto the network. And you've also, interestingly, got very increasingly complex collaborative arrangements. So people are working not only with other individuals within your organization, but they're working with people in other institutions, in industry, people who are at home, people who are on sabbatical away for a while. So these all provide major challenges. Also, another unique factor really to the campus environment is that you need to be able to facilitate rapid adoption of emerging technology. Our corporate, people managing networks in the corporate arena would tend to take a very conservative approach. So they really would say with an emerging technology, well, we'll wait and see what happens, we'll wait and see what other people's experiences are, we'll wait until there are security tools, you know, available to monitor this, to allow us to control it, and we'll wait till maybe other people have developed policies that we can just adopt as well. And also in terms of the organization as a whole, universities tend to be quite decentralized. So the network, you know, a lot of the network's focused around the edge. You've got kind of pockets of activity away from the core activity that's maybe managed by the centralized IT department. So when you look at how to deploy your policy, really the traditional implementation would be start at the top and work down. So management approve the policy, and it's then pushed down through the organization through, you know, your administrative structure. However, when you think about your campus, you probably realize that it doesn't really look like that. So, okay, you've got a governing body, but then underneath that you may have different committees governing different areas, schools and faculties, your admin areas, the student body and their activities, and you may also have campus companies, commercial entities working maybe within research departments or on their own in your university. And you may find it looks a bit more like this. So you can see your end users are kind of buried within this structure, and initially looking at this, it's very difficult to see, well, I've got this rigid policy and I want every end user to comply with it, but just how exactly am I going to communicate this with them? How do I know who are the appropriate people to talk about helping me with enforcing the policy? What do I do if I have an end user who's misbehaving? You know, how am I supposed to know, sitting over in my campus network administration office, who I should get in touch with? And it's really quite daunting. I mean, it's really causes a difficulty with if you were just going to go with the default kind of strategy where you thought you could pass it off to your board and leave it to them, say, right, pass it down to the users. You realize quite quickly that's just not going to happen. So at this point, I think then it's helpful to focus on, okay, we've looked at the differences, but now we'll focus on the similarities. Just to kind of bring us back and say, because you could start to say, well, maybe all those academics that I meet in the corridor who tell me, look, firewalls are irrelevant to my community, you know, what are you talking about, access controls? Maybe they're right. So I think at this point, it's useful then to think, well, no, not really, because even though it's a very diverse network, it's got a lot of unique characteristics, it also has a lot of characteristics that all large networks have. So, you know, we have to provide high quality, flexible services. We have to protect our confidential data. And I mean, we really have a legal imperative to do that. We have a lot of data, personal data on students, on staff members, a lot of research data. You know, increasingly you have medical data, maybe if you have a lot of medical departments. So it's really not an option just to say, well, I won't protect it. Also, you have all the same internal, external security threats as any large network. And you need as well to have the same kind of contingency and disaster recovery plans that any large network would have. And so hopefully, after thinking about all that, you would come to the conclusion, well, despite of it, maybe because of the complexity, it really is more important than ever to somehow get a good, strong framework around the network, which will help you to lay out how you're going to protect the network, but also in a way that's going to facilitate all the needs of all your many kinds of users. So, you know, accepting that all their activities have to somehow be facilitated. How will you do that in a secure way? So the answer, well, I don't think you can start without first of all looking at the management structure. You're going to have to come up with some kind of governance model for IT in general. Otherwise, you really don't have anywhere to start. And in doing this, you need to identify the stakeholders. So rather than, you know, it's not an autocratic type of an organization. You can't just start to tell people this is the policy and you have to do it this way. What you really need to do is involve all the people who are interested, all the sort of edge networks, research departments, and say, you know, this is our policy, we want to create it together, and you want to let them have input so that they will feel some kind of ownership of the policy, and there's more hope that they will cooperate in implementing it. Also, I think it's really important to start with the high-value assets. I wouldn't normally admit this, but really I have to accept that it's not possible to secure everything all of the time. So with limited resources, you've got to say, well, what are the really important things that I'm going to start with, and start there and hopefully work out. Also, segregation and flexibility again come into play, because the traditional campus network where everything was just in one large flat pool, you know, all these competing activities, just isn't compatible with allowing you to have a flexible, secure model. You know, if you've got some really important data in that pool, well then, you know, you've got to secure that data, which means that you don't have the flexibility to let people perform other activities that might put that at risk. So really what we said was, well, we're going to have to segregate things here along sort of, you know, reasonable functional boundaries and say, well, that's high security data, that's going to have to be subject to tight controls, whereas this is probably, you know, lower importance, so we can allow more flexibility. So having realized this then in Trinity College, what we did, well, in 2003 we implemented our policy. From 2004 on then we started awareness exercises, so we have a website which details all the policies and also tries to translate them into a more user-friendly kind of a language so people can understand what it really means to them. We also circulated booklets and you know, we constantly send emails talking about new things that we have going on. And then, of course, we had to translate that to operational procedures, so agree with the people in the computer centres what it meant for them as system administrators, for, say, people developing software or applications, what it meant for them. And then after that, we looked, I suppose, at the actual controls. So what, in terms of, we have our framework, what are the actual technological controls that we're going to implement in order to make this work? So we came up with a security management system, and in the middle is the security policy, and around that then is the various other players, the management and their commitment, risk assessment. We didn't mention risk assessment, but obviously that's quite a vital part in deciding what your controls should be. You know, you want to identify your risks as well as your assets. And then in terms of enforcement, you know, and monitoring and training and awareness for end users, and of course our disaster recovery. And we looked then at IT security governance. So we said, well, you know, who is in charge here? So we identified that there was a governing committee, and then we looked at the main kind of the operational network, and then looked at all the other edge players we called autonomous networks. And we got them all involved in the creation of the policy, and we came up with written agreements with them as to who does what. What we had found was that, you know, there was a lot on the edge of duplication of services, so people kind of out on their own doing the same thing as somebody else is doing in the centre, and it just didn't really seem to make sense. You know, why expend all those resources and all that time doing something that's already done somewhere else quite well, quite securely? So we came up with agreements as to who would do what, and I think that has had, you know, a really good impact on the network as a whole. I mean, we've got really good communication now between all the stakeholders and all the groups, and it really helped, of course, to have those stakeholders to disseminate all the information to their end users in some way. And together then we worked on the supporting documentation. That's just a sample of the kind of policies that we came up with to actually practically help people with what their roles and responsibilities were. And we then moved on to adopting technology. So once we had the framework in place, you know, we knew we needed some kind of segregation. We needed areas where people could do more high-risk activity, and we also needed areas where we could put our really important assets and keep them secure. So it became obvious, well, you know, we need a VLAN, we need to be able to firewall areas off from one another. And we looked at our users. You know, we had users who wanted to, mobility was key, so we had users who wanted to be able to go off to other areas but still have secure access back to their resources. So things like VPNs, the obvious solution. For our hosts, we wanted to address, you know, our problems with viruses, worms, malware in general. So we went with the managed kind of solution for them. So we had managed AV, managed updates. So, and the managed part of it means that we could have a certain amount of assurance. So we could look at a console and say, well, we've got, you know, 80% of our hosts patched up to date, antivirus up to date. And in knowing that, then you knew that the, you know, your risks were significantly lower. We also went with an enterprise directory because authentication was such a key interest that we had. We wanted to be able to provide secure authentication, and also to try to consolidate it so that users weren't, you know, telling users they have to have secure passwords and then also telling them they need about 10 different accounts to access all the different systems is a bit of a contradiction. So our security boundaries really became clear. We have our central services in the middle, and then our other areas with their different kind of security ratings around the side, our autonomous networks, our student areas where we can allow students, you know, a bit more flexibility, the ability to do things. And then, of course, specialized research areas where you can leave the research projects free to do what they need to do without impacting necessarily the rest of the network. We also have specialized things like, you know, we actually have retail systems, cash, you know, electronic point of sale, cash registers, etc. And we can just keep them away from the main body of the network. In terms then of assessing our progress, I think everyone would agree that we have, you know, really done a lot with the communication, and you can see that the improved communications between all the different stakeholders is quite obvious. Also, having a clear framework really helps with focus for strategic planning. So if someone's you know, coming up with a new application or a new system, they know that they're expected to think about security in all stages of it, you know, but well before implementation, but when they're going out to look for a new system, because they know as well they'll be audited at the end, so it helps people's focus. With incident reporting as well, then we can really see our success in terms of, we're not immune to viruses, worms, spyware, but the impact of them is much reduced. You know, there'll always be a user who'll manage to circumvent all your controls, but at least when that happens, the rest of the network is okay. You know, they're not infected as well. You don't have the wide-scale kind of disruptions that we used to have. And we don't have as many reports from certs letting us know that we have rogue servers out there. We also have internal controls. We have internal audits on systems and also external audits. So we get an external company to come in as a kind of a sanity check to tell us, yes, what you're doing is right. And as time goes on, you know, it becomes more difficult for them. There's less and less there for them to come up with. They have a harder job. And maybe one day in the future we'll be brave enough maybe to go down the certification route. And you know, if we had confidence that maybe just in a localized area, maybe our central services or something. And in the future then, just to finish off, there are lots of challenges coming down the line. We have a massive increase in user numbers. We have students coming in with their own laptops. We have members of the public that we have to facilitate. We have a guest network, and we also have EduRoam services. And we also have more non-traditional network devices, so PDAs, Xboxes, you know, everything's got a network card and we want to get it on the network. And at the same time, our network boundary is starting to disappear. People are more and more mobile. They're all over the place, all wanting access to their key resources, adopting new technology, changing threat profiles. More and more we have a role in helping people to protect their own private data, so helping users, you know, to be aware of, you know, phishing emails so that they don't inadvertently disclose their own information. And with all these challenges, you know, I'm very glad that we do have a strong security framework, because I think if we hadn't adopted the policy, if we hadn't implemented all these controls, we really would be in a very poor situation today. And we wouldn't be in the situation where we're able to facilitate our users, because we would still be in the situation where we find ourselves having to say no, you know, not because we didn't want people to do things, but because we just couldn't see how we could facilitate what they wanted to do while also keeping everything else in the network running and secure. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions? Just a few references here, some of the sites that I spoke about, if anyone wants to look at them.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. Just while waiting for the microphone, Sarah mentioned eCar as being part of EduCause, and they do this survey in the US, but they're actually coming to Europe next month to start trying to get some European research as well, so it won't be purely research. Sorry, question.
I wanted to ask you how deeply you can enter the structure of the university with your policy. I mean, you did mention schools, faculties, and so on, which are fairly independent. Are you actually auditing them and telling them, no, you can't do these things? Is it just the plan, or is it already implemented?
No, this happens. All the, as I said, we have agreements between the various areas that are involved in kind of major technology areas. And I can go in and audit, and as part of our internal audit and our external audit, we would look at all those areas. But we don't like to think of it as telling people they can or can't do things. You know, it's trying to help them do it in the secure way.
One question. What do you do how can I say it? I forgot it, sorry. How do you enforce your policy? Do you enforce it just discuss with the other parties, or you have some way to enforce it?
It's enforced by actively monitoring for any kind of infringements, and also then having regular audits.
And you can enforce it to the faculties or the departments, or which tend to be a bit autonomous, or?
Yeah, well, it's set at the college level, so I mean it applies to everybody, and it's implicit in every say staff members' contract of employment, students when they register, and you know, everybody is bound by it really.
Okay, then well done.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much, sir, again. Thank you. All right, as we change over the microphones, our next speaker is Stuart Cunningham from the University of Wales. For those who have good ears, they may hear a different accent, as he's in fact from Scotland. He's a lecturer in the University of Wales, but has done his study in Scotland. There's a sort of a theme running through the afternoon about the law, and I'm not sure about the law and what Stuart has done in looking at Wi-Fi access points. I won't say hacking into them, but analysing them in Wales. So, Stuart, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Yeah, so I'm Stuart Cunningham from the North East Wales Institute, which is in the northern part of Wales, as the title suggests. And I'm from the Centre for Applied Internet Research, which is one of the largest research groups within our own institution. And as you can guess, I'm actually an academic, and I feel as though I'm perhaps a little bit in the minority here amongst all these people from industry, so I would beg that you please be gentle with me, if nothing else. So our title is Study of the Geographic Spread and Security of Wireless Access Points, and really this is to do with looking at it within a localised area. And I think it sort of fits quite well the scope of this year's Terrena conference of visible services and transparent networks. Because to be honest, I don't think you can really get more transparent than wireless networks and Wi-Fi access. And particularly from our perspective of looking at it in terms of user uptake, it's very appropriate because they really do just see the services that are there at the end of the day, and maybe don't necessarily have the domain-specific knowledge that we might have to do with things like security, for example. So again, just to give you a bit of background to start with, a little bit of history. Again, this sort of is a legacy from being an academic. I sort of assume that you know nothing before you start because I'm used to talking to students, but please sort of bear with that as well. So we know that we've always had a sort of large uptake of Wi-Fi, particularly in recent years, and it's really spread from businesses and industry now to the point of where you can go out into the street and find hotspots. And it's in hotels and in people's homes and so on. So it gets used across a wide sort of variety of areas, as we've indicated here. But in particular, what we are focused on is more the end user point of view of people at home who've set up wireless networks, mainly for their own personal use, and sort of the uptake and the impacts that this might have upon them. So there's a large increased scope for research in these areas, across all of these different sort of categories that we have, home, business, and academic. But mainly what's been done to date has tended to look at things like service utilization, how much people actually roam around when they're connected to a Wi-Fi network, as opposed to being attached somewhere by a cable, and the behavioural studies, the type of stuff that they download, and the type of services that they perhaps use. So we wanted to approach it from a slightly different perspective. So we found that there's less work being done in determining secure services and where those are actually implemented, again, particularly for home users. So the nature of wireless sort of means that your physical boundaries are insignificant, and I'll kind of come back to this in a couple of slides, but particularly for for industry, they were quite quick to sort of respond to the fact that you've removed the physical boundaries in essence. But perhaps for your home users, your personal users, this maybe isn't quite as obvious. So we kind of came up with a few questions based around this. The main one really for us, we all sort of take it for granted that lots of people use Wi-Fi, but how do we actually know that they are? And where's your evidence that particularly people in their homes are using it? So just how big is the Wi-Fi uptake in the community? And after that, what is the actual awareness of security? Are people aware, are they unaware, or do they just take it out of the box and they set it up? And if there is security built in, then that's great and it goes and it works, but not necessarily. And also then that got us to think, well, if you are going to look at a group of users who are in a community and an environment, then what are the differences between, you know, obvious different areas and clusters of types of user within that geographic area? And are there any differences? So these were the main sort of questions that we wanted to try and address as part of this work. So we carried out a case study. We went across what was approximately a 16-kilometre square area, which did incorporate quite a large proportion of residential areas, industrial and commercial sectors. So we thought this was a fairly representative spread of the types of user communities that we would normally have within a large sort of town or city area. And so just to tell you a bit about the equipment, we just use a Wi-Fi enabled laptop and a GPS as well, a global positioning system, which would allow us to actually map the places at which we encountered these access points. And so effectively, we followed the road network across this area, which has some sort of interesting observations when you look at the data in a moment, and also when you come to think about how you actually cover a square 16-kilometre area following the road network, because often you find there's, particularly in Wales, there's fields in the middle, and so that's a kind of a bit of a challenge. So it took us approximately 10 hours to drive across this area as sort of thoroughly as we could, really, and trying to be very methodical about what we were doing. And detecting the access points, so we had the ability to detect whether an access point was secure or not secure. So that was sort of significant to the study. So what we effectively tried to do, and I could see some people sort of thinking this as I was saying it, you went war driving, didn't you? Yeah, basically we did. I've been trying to think on like a better term than war driving. I thought ethical war driving maybe, or peace driving, yeah, that was another one that I did come up with. So I don't know, you guys are like the main community here, so maybe if you adopt one of these terms, it'll start getting used a bit more. But really what we wanted to do was, rather than go out and be very unrealistic and take huge antenna and things like that with us so that we could pick up, you know, every access point in sight, we wanted to try and sort of reflect the scenario of someone who might be war driving and may or may not have malicious intent in mind when they did that. And really it comes down to this kind of concept of the parking lot attack, which I'm sure you're all aware of, the concept. If we take this diagram that we've got on the slide here, and if you just were to remove the wireless parts for a moment, you would find a very sort of historically familiar scenario with a corporate network where your main sort of methods of penetration for an attacker would be either to actually breach your physical security measures and log into one of the workstations internally, or to come in through the internet. And so the diagram's quite representative because we've got sort of a barrier or a wall, for want of a better term here, and we've got a firewall here to protect the internet intrusions. But now, of course, because we're enabling things with Wi-Fi, you've effectively got another pathway now, and your physical security measure becomes redundant. So there's scope for this sort of thing, and it's really a sort of crucial issue that people need to think about addressing. And although this is done in large corporations and enterprises, the home users are very much reliant on the fact that there is a wall between you and the outside world, because security often isn't really considered as a big important thing for personal users. You've got a wall, so no one's going to get in and log onto your workstation. So we did this case study and drove around. This is just sort of anecdotal. I didn't know quite how internationally famous or infamous the Pringles tube would be, but the idea is that you would just hide an antenna inside so that you could be a bit more inconspicuous holding a Pringles tube above your head when you went war driving. I couldn't figure quite how that worked. But, So this is the result of the mapping that we did. We've got our 16-kilometre square area here. We have anonymized the data for obvious purposes. So I won't give you any clues as to the north-south orientation or so on of the mapping that we've got there. But you can see that there's a reasonable sort of spread of access points across this area. There's some sort of areas where they're a bit more clumped together. There's higher concentrations. And again, we said that we followed the road network because that was the most practical way of addressing the task in hand. And that kind of is reflected in the diagram, to be honest, because you can sort of see the pathways of certain roads in some places. And you also see a lot of white space, and that's just where there simply aren't roads. Now, one would assume that where there aren't roads, there aren't people and there aren't access points. But again, until we've actually gone out and proved that, we can't say for certain, but we make that assumption. So over this area, we found 1,153 access points over that sort of small area. Just to give you an idea of what the sort of the town that we looked at is, the population is somewhere in the region in that area of about 40 to 50,000 people. So you can get an idea of the density of it. And to give you some local information before we kind of move on, what you would see here is very much a sort of distinct residential area, which is distinct from here, where approximately there's another residential area. And here we've got the majority of the industrial and the commercial. But of course that is interspersed with some residential as well, because you end up getting houses built on top of shops and so on. And again, down at the bottom end here, we've got another sort of residential area. So our results are kind of skewed by the fact that there is a lot of personal networks out there. But we kind of move on anyway. So we then address how many of these are secure and how many of these are unsecure. And so the red dots, meaning stop, of course, mean that these are secure networks, and the green are unsecure. Now, we actually were reasonably surprised by the amount of secure networks that there were out there. We sort of expected to see less, and we undertook a pilot study last year just to kind of prove the concept of what we were doing. And when we did that, we found a lot less access points, and we also found a lot more access points that weren't secure. So we were quite impressed, but still, there's almost a quarter of these access points which aren't secure. And so that's kind of an area for concern, certainly from a community point of view. And also just sort of notionally, because we could, we also sort of detailed how many are effectively running 802.11b and 802.11g. And as we expected, again, the majority of people go for the 54 megabit per second range. So then what we thought was, well, okay, this is quite good. So we can see the secure and the unsecure. But what would be nice is if we could actually look to see where the real dense areas are and to see if that is actually reflected in what we know about the geographic area. So this is okay when you have the domain-specific knowledge of an area to say, well, yes, that is a town, and that's the residential area, and this is the commercial area. But when you don't, you have to kind of approach it from a sort of statistical point of view. So we wanted to try and do this to see if we could sort of automatically, if you like, identify where the logical groups were. And again, big clusters and big densities does suggest that there would be more of a community there. So what we did was we actually ran the k-means algorithm on the data that we had. Again, very straightforward because it's in Cartesian space. So we ran the k-means across it. Now, one of the limitations of the k-means algorithm, of course, is that you have to tell it how many clusters you want to look for. And again, that can be somewhat restrictive. But we tried several iterations, and the best sort of combinations that we came up with were 3 and 4 clusters. So we can see here that it's kind of identified broadly that we've got this residential part here, although we really know that these are sort of two distinct communities. And the blue area, which obviously has a very, very high membership, there's actually a lot of overlapping dots in here that you can't necessarily see. And the green area was probably the best result from the 3 cluster iteration, because that really was more or less a sort of distinct community area here. But they didn't quite correlate against what we actually knew. So then when we ran with 4 clusters, we could actually sort of reasonably get to a point now where it had identified the distinct communities that we were certainly aware of when we undertook the tests. So you can see here there's a lot more, I mean, this shows you the membership of each of the clusters, and you can see there's a much more broader spread, particularly in terms of the size of the membership. And this is also much more reflective, because you have indeed a very distinct residential community here, which is very large. And over here we've got this other residential, another one, and then here the granularity ran out at this point for the blue cluster, because it really did incorporate the commercial and the industrial, and to sort of tease them out wasn't really practical. We did run k-means again with 5, 6, 7, 8 clusters as well, but at that point it just became, there was too much disparity between the clusters that it was picking up. So we found, again, just to give you the headlines really from that the majority of them were secure, against as well a notional study which was undertaken by some representatives. I can't remember the name of the organisation. It may have been Nortel, I think, in 2002. And they revealed that 66% at that point were unsecure. Obviously not in the same actual area, but it was certainly a representative sample. But still almost 25% being unsecure is a bit kind of worrying, certainly from the sense of where did these occur and were they in the residential areas in particular. So the clustering gives us an advantage in that we can sort of pick out these points. Now, one other way to approach it, of course, is that if you do actually know where there are certain zones, you can then sort of start to correlate that against other things that you happen to know about those particular zones. And so, for example, we thought, well, it would be really nice to know, for example, if you took a deprived area, would there be a lot of access points or not so many access points? And would those access points be secure? Would they be unsecure? So if you can actually, we came up with this concept of giving a security index, if you like, for each of these zones. And if you like, a zone can be analogous to one of those clusters that we looked at. So we could define these zones within the mapping, and each zone would have a membership which is made up of all of the access points that fall within it. And then by taking each zone and identifying the secure access points and the unsecure access points, then with this very sort of simple, straightforward formula, you effectively come up with an index. And obviously, the higher the value that you get out of that index, the more secure that particular zone is. And if you can then have that sort of ranking almost, you can set it off against other things that you happen to know about that particular area. So in particular, you could link it to things to do with the zone itself. So the level of industrial activity, property value, council taxes, for example. These are all things that can give you different pieces of information and relationships about the type of people who use this area and the sort of status of it. But also something that might be sort of interesting from an industrial point of view in particular is that you could offset it against, okay, the density of the access points, the type of the access points, but you could also look at the vendor of the access point and find out which zones correlated against different vendors. So you may find that, for example, the zones which have a very low security index all correlate against a certain manufacturer, which at that point, alarm bells ring if you're a manufacturer and sort of think, well, I've got to write my handbook a little bit better. Because we remember that a lot of the people who are using these networks at home aren't going to necessarily have the knowledge that we have to say, okay, I've got a wireless access point, I'm going to secure it now. It tends to be more, I've taken it out of the box and set it up and it works, and that's great, I've got internet, brilliant, I'm not worried about the network, it's transparent, that's great, but I can see my services. So they take this very sort of pragmatic approach to things. So by figuring out these things that we know about the zones, if we have that knowledge, and offsetting it against the security index is sort of an area for where we're going to move into next. What we intend to do ultimately is to give this information to the community, obviously, that we surveyed, so that there's actually a purpose to it. And again, this addresses the point that, you know, academics, well, we sit in our ivory towers and we write lots of nice stuff, but we don't really do very much for people. So we're absolutely trying to address that legacy, and we're going to try and release this, talk to people in the community. Obviously, a qualitative study would then make sense to follow up and actually talk to people in these distinct areas about the configurations and their awareness of the different security aspects and so on. But ultimately, we want to make them more aware of the type of security measures that exist, and in industry as well. Because again, we always assume that industry take consultancy when they do these sort of things, but very much in small industry, you may not have that opportunity, and you might have actually done it yourself. So things like the aerial footprinting and the antenna positioning, obviously they're a bit sort of controversial because of the idea, well, a wireless network should be open and should be accessible. But at the same time, common sense does sort of prevail in terms of thinking about the footprint and where you actually want the signal to be sent. I was in an installation recently where they had a number of offices in a corridor, and they'd actually put all the access points on the corridor facing away from the offices. So if you go outside onto the grass, the signal goes through the window and you can get the best internet access, fastest in the whole building, outside on the grass. But if you're in your office, the access point faces away from you and you get very little. So it's really, there's a lot of common sense has to be applied here. And making people aware of, again, the other software-based encryption tools and so on that are available. WEP, obviously, we know there's lots of shortcomings with WEP. But WPA, smart cards, hiding the SSIDs, ACLs and so on are all good measures that people, once they're shown how to implement, can actually do fairly quickly. Although probably, in fact, a hybrid mixture of these is the best solution rather than relying purely on one of them. So to kind of conclude and give you an idea of where we sort of plan to go and some of the issues that came up as we did this, we've obviously established that, yes, there is quite a large uptake of Wi-Fi in the community. We were quite impressed with the number of access points that we detected as we went around, and also the fact that we could pick out these distinct zones based on this information and kind of relate that to something. Obviously, it was sort of slightly biased by the fact that we used this GPS, and it isn't going to give you absolute accuracy unless you're prepared to walk up to someone's door every time you want to detect an access point. So when you look at the mapping, it does tend to reflect the road network to an extent. And also, as I said, if you can't get to an area where there isn't a road, we sort of assume that there isn't access points in there, but you never know. And so it would be much more rigorous to actually go through and do that. One of the interesting things that we found out is obviously driving through the road network, you tend to go up and down a lot of the same streets. Yeah? If you want to be very methodical and cover a square area, and to try and get down to almost every meter within that square area, it's quite difficult using the road network to find an optimal path. And so we sort of thought, yeah, there's implications here, and they used to call it the Chinese postman problem, and I think it's now been redressed as the route inspection problem, where you're sort of trying to find effectively a shortest path, but covering an exceptionally large number of waypoints as you go through that path. And it was quite interesting to consider that, because we thought, we've been up and down this street several times, and we had an interesting occurrence because one of the days that we went out to collect our data, it was actually rubbish collection day. And we ended up following one of the bin lorries around for quite some time. And they sort of looked at us very strangely the 100th time that we went past them and backed up a street next to them. But we thought, well, they've probably got it sussed, in fact, because they do this every day, so they've probably got a much more efficient route than we have. So I think there's things to be learned there in terms of data collection. More detailed detection mechanisms. One of the things that I would point out is that we were only able at this moment to detect the WEP secured access points as opposed to anything else. So this does have an impact on the commercial industries where perhaps they use a kind of web-based type security interface, something like BlueSocket, let's say. That shows up as being unsecure. So that's obviously something we'd like more granularity there to see if we can actually get down into more detail. And we also thought two other things in terms of comparisons. Would it be different if we went out at night and did the same study? Would we detect more or less access points? Would they be more secure, unsecure? And also comparing it with other regions. So what we'd like to do is to go out to another town of a similar size and perform the same exercise there, maybe not on the bin collection day, but to go out and see and compare it. And again, maybe that'll have some reflections in terms of the sociology behind it and the economic factors. So that's sort of things that we plan to do with it in the future. So that's it. So if anyone's got any questions.
Great. Thanks very much. I do have a problem with you describing the distinction between secure and insecure, when in fact what you've measured is presence of encryption or not presence of encryption. Because in practice, web is not at all secure against your neighbours, who can sit there, collect enough packets, and then use your connection if they wish to. And a system like mine, where I've got ACLs sitting on it, and no encryption, means that in practice it is more secure almost certainly than my next door neighbour with web, but you will measure it as insecure. So I've got no problem with the fact you measured it. I've got a great deal of problem with the way in which you described it, because I think it loads it up as to whether or not you can actually do anything with these points in practice. So that was one point I wanted to make. Second point I wanted to make was that I've seen studies like this. There was one done in Aachen last year, which was presented at the Weiss workshop, and they were trying to tie together encryption usage with essentially social class in the towns they were looking at. They came up with a very poor match for that, because their conclusion was that whether or not you were using encryption was entirely down to the model of device that you bought, and that was more to do with when you bought it rather than how rich you were or what sort of job you did. And the final observation I wanted to make, which your data might be worth looking at, is one of my colleagues did more for the effectiveness of security down his street than anything else. What he did is he went door to door, because what he was actually trying to do is get people to use different channels in order to get a better channel utilization down the street. Right? And whilst he was doing that, he mentioned the fact that some of them weren't encrypted and they might like to think about the issues there. He wasn't telling them what to do, but he was trying to tell them what to do, because if they used a different channel, then there'd be less interference.
Yeah. No, I take all of those points quite gladly, to be honest, and we've certainly considered them. The web one, as opposed to something like ACLs and so on, is quite valid, and obviously it becomes harder to detect those things without actually trying to penetrate the network. But I mean, one of the sort of things that we thought was, well, our primary objective, perhaps not quite scientifically, is to raise awareness of the issues, try and make people aware and get them to sort of think about addressing them. So yeah.
Okay. Does anyone?
So I had kind of a similar comment to. So I had a kind of similar comment to the first one, but the flip side of it, which is that just because something doesn't have an access restriction doesn't mean that it's insecure, because maybe the goal is to allow people access to it.
Yeah.
Because if you go, I always remember being in San Francisco in the U.S., which is known for its sort of liberal social thinkers. And if you look at the SSIDs there, you see like free the net and, you know, access here for everyone and things like that. So what I was wondering is if you saw anything in the SSIDs of the networks that you monitored that indicated anything about the intentions of the people that set them up.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you mentioned that, actually, because we obviously did detect quite a lot of access points. And some of the names of the SSIDs were rather provocative in certain cases. There weren't any that specifically said, yes, come in, but there were a few that sort of, very politely, of course, said, go away. But we didn't find any with that sort of, that slant on them. Certainly, I've not come across that, but it is an interesting point, actually. And again, it kind of takes into account some of the legal aspects, because there's people who now, there's cases where people have started to be prosecuted for piggybacking on people's networks and doing malicious things. And so I guess the argument sort of from the opposite side there would be, well, how did you know whether or not you should be using this network unless they have specifically called it something like free the net or, you know, come on in which case I might be a bit apprehensive, in fact.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a whole other.
Yeah.
Just to add to statistics of yours, I've done a similar research in Lithuania, in my hometown, and I've done it 2 years in a row. Not driving a car, but driving a bike, which gives you more access to different locations.
But
so
you're probably
the
a lot fitter
statistics,
than me, though, right?
Yes. So the statistics for 2004 is 62 access points are insecure. 62% of access points.
Yeah, are unsecure.
Yeah, unsecure. So in a similar matter, how you described it, just doesn't use any encryption, but it doesn't say anything about IPsec or something similar. So, and 2% of those access points are in default configuration.
Do I know if they're in default configuration, did you say?
2%.
2%, oh sorry, okay, yeah.
And in 2005, the next year, the unsecure access point percentage dropped to 53%. So over the time, it's the number of insecure access points now down just decreased.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, your data sort of backs up the assumptions that I'd made from the study in 2002, which sort of suggests that obviously implementation of security measures will go up. But you know, as the comment was rightly over here, that something like WEP, which appears as a security measure, maybe isn't completely effective, and we perhaps want a better solution than that.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Stuart. Thank you again. I just had a comment. I don't know that I'd really like to connect to an access point that says come on in. I think from a security perspective I might be a bit suspicious. Anyway, that's so Tarina sounds a reasonable SSID or edge room. Anyway, our next speaker is Joe Sansovier from Internet 2 and also from the University of Oregon. Joe's involved in security in Internet 2 and is an assistant CIO to the CIO of the University of Oregon and has a long history in security aspects and is going to talk about new legal aspects of US law. Okay.
Thank you. We've got copies of the slides that are going to get handed out to you today, and part of that's because I tend to have a little bit of an unusual approach to speaking. Some people may have a few slides and then say a lot about them. I tend to have a lot of slides and say relatively few things about them. So as you look through things, don't panic. We promise we'll get you out of here on time to go ahead and make the BOFs or the hot dog cart or just to get out of here. So what we're going to go ahead and do today is talk a little bit about what we think the law enforcement folks are going to want when it comes to facilitating network lawful intercepts for things like CALEA. And because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a cop, this doesn't really express any sort of official opinion. What I've gone ahead and done is look at what the law enforcement types say they want, what the higher education networks have built, and some of the public documents and standards that are out there, and look to see whether or not those things are congruent. Is it going to be possible for law enforcement to get what they want based on what's currently deployed? So we're going to go ahead and talk about that, and I think you'll see that there are a few areas where there's a fairly fundamental disconnect, and I think there's going to be some changes that are going to be coming down the line to make things work a little better. First question to address probably is, what is CALEA? And it's the Communication Assistance Act for Law Enforcement, and it really dates from 1994, so it's a relatively old law. And what it really does is not create any sort of new wiretap requirements. It just provides sort of a due diligence statute. It requires that folks be ready to assist law enforcement if they're asked. And one of the things that you'll see is, in addition to going ahead and facilitating that sort of a network interception, it also has very stringent privacy requirements, ironically enough, for the folks who are not the subjects of those orders. And it also goes ahead and wants to ensure that people can continue to innovate at the network level. So it has these multiple objectives, of which only one of them really is facilitating intercept. And what you're going to see is that recently it was actually extended to broadband providers. Originally it applied just to telephone folks, but now it applies to broadband folks as well, including some higher education networks. And a number of the European countries have similar laws. I think there's a Section 88 law in Germany and RIPA, I think, in the UK and so on. So I think this is going to go ahead and still have some generalization for folks over here. In the old days, wiretaps were done manually. So you'd have essentially a court order get issued. The local provider would get contacted by the law enforcement officer to go ahead and begin executing that intercept order. They'd usually go ahead and drag their lawyers into it to make sure it was lawful for them to help. And assuming everything worked out there, then they'd go ahead and start doing the physical steps of installing optical splitters or bridging ports and so on. The traffic from that intercept would get minimized, and then law enforcement would go ahead and receive it and could start working on that whole process. But that's not something that's painless or rapid or very inexpensive. And the reality is that they don't fit very well in internet age. So, if you think about the internet, one of its key characteristics is that it's very agile. Well, the sort of wiretap process I just described is not a very agile one. And by this, I mean, by the time the wiretap order may have gotten processed, it may have been a period of weeks or months before it actually has gotten installed, and yet the person who is using a given connection at that point may no longer even be at a particular site. There are things called roving or multi-point wiretaps that are designed to sort of follow a person rather than specifying a particular location, but those are very rare. As an example, only 15 of those in the United States in all of 2006. So when you start thinking about all these things, it starts to become a sort of odd world. CALIA is designed to kind of fix some of those issues, but it's not something that did a very good job of it. CALIA is not actually something that a single federal agency owns in the United States. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is actually sort of the lead agency for this, ironically enough, with a lot of input from the FBI, but the Drug Enforcement Administration and things like the customs folks also are very much involved. And because of that sort of consensus approach, probably none of those agencies are fully satisfied with what they get out. I should also mention that CALIA was something that was done via, or the extension of CALIA to broadband providers is something that was done by a very creative interpretation of that existing statute. It wasn't very clear that it really applied to a lot of broadband providers. So that's the sort of thing that resulted in litigation. And the litigation was not very clean. It was actually something that resulted in a tortured decision that was recently released. So when you get done putting all those things together, CALIA doesn't end up having a lot of solidity or have a very good sense of being a legitimate thing. It's also had a very slow rollout, and that's in part because the standards aren't actually specified by the laws. The standards get developed by industry and then are essentially approved by some of the folks at the FCC or the DOJ. So all in all, it's a very expensive sort of process, it's a very slow sort of process, but it's what we have. Because they've been trying to implement CALIA for a while, we actually know quite a bit about it. So for example, the Department of Justice Inspector General actually does an annual review of CALIA. And one of the things they find out is that in spite of CALIA's existence, many law enforcement officers don't take advantage of it. Why? Well, it's quite expensive, and they don't really require the features that CALIA offers above and beyond a traditional wiretap. So if you look at the sort of numbers that you're seeing, a traditional wiretap, about $250. And a wiretap with CALIA features, about 10 times that. So if you're a cash-strapped law enforcement agency, if you don't need those other features, what are you going to go ahead and do? Well, you'll do a traditional order and go the traditional route. The Department of Justice also recognizes some of the realities. Things like cybercafe is a huge hole relative to what CALIA can go ahead and adequately address. Things like electronic encryption go ahead and challenge CALIA's ability to deliver what law enforcement might want. There's just a fascinating list of these sorts of issues. There's quite a long report there. They provide a citation that you can go ahead and check. But the point is that CALIA is not a perfect beast. One of the things that may help is talking a little bit about lawful intercept by the numbers. And by this I mean, if you think about lawful intercepts, you may think, oh, these guys are wiretap crazy and they're wiretapping everything all the time, or they never use it at all. And the reality is somewhere in between. So about 461 federal intercept orders, 1,378 at the state level, sort of the smaller granularity, with a lot of the states not having any at all. 27 state courts issued no wiretap orders at all. Oregon, where I'm from, had one. California, on the other hand, had 430. New York had 377, and so forth. These wiretaps were installed for a fairly long period of time. The average was about 40 days. And the number of folks who were intercepted based on either calling in or someone calling out to them through this wiretap connection was about 122. The part that I hadn't known until I started looking into this a bit was that a lot of these wiretaps involve drug-related offenses, 80% by number for this last year, and racketeering, things like the mafia types and so on, and homicide and assault were the other two things. And now this is something I don't quite know how to explain given the earlier numbers I told you about the cost, but the Inspector General's numbers were $67,000 for a typical intercept at the federal level and almost $45,000 at the state. So any way you look at it, these are not cheap. The other thing I hadn't understood is that many of these things involve telephones and only telephones. So 96% were for telephones, most of them actually for cell phones. And there were no interceptions that involved encryption, that ran into encryption. So if you think about security and how important it can be, well, a lot of higher education really stresses encryption. Well, apparently the bad guys don't really have the message. So encryption is something that's not really posed an issue for folks so far. Only 13 requests out of 1,800 or so were for computers or for other digital things like digital pagers or faxes. So, everyone always worries that the folks are out there snooping computers a lot. Well, at least in terms of traditional law enforcement, they're not. Now, I will tell you that this does not include FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act type interceptions. This is only the criminal side of things. So as a result, if you look at the FISA-related numbers, they actually dwarf the criminal side. But because the focus today is at least on CALIA, be aware that it's really not about computers. So then we come to the universities, and universities are really very law-abiding places for the most part. The administrations want to comply with the law, but we're all poor. So folks look to see, do they need to do this, or is it something that's essentially elective? And what they have found as they look at the law is that in many cases it's something that indeed they may be exempt from. One exemption is called the private network exemption. And you would hear that sort of term and you would expect something that's disconnected from the internet entirely. You would think that it would be something that's totally disjoint, just an internal network that has no sort of external connectivity. But the reality is, as the FCC defines it, that's not true. So they go ahead and have this sort of painful footnote, which I have reproduced in its entirety for you, but let me just give you the bottom line, which is things as broad in scope as Abilene, the Internet 2 network, NYSERNet, the New York State network, the Pacific Northwest Gigapop, which spans multiple states, all have been declared by the FCC to be private networks, exempt from CALIA, at least to the extent that they do not interconnect with the internet. So it's one of those situations where private networks don't necessarily mean what you might expect. Another thing that came up over time is many people worried that they would have to instrument their networks at the level of every switch port so that essentially they could go ahead and drill down very finely. The FCC, again, was very kind, however, in noting that you only really needed to instrument your internet gateway. And if there was traffic that was within the private network that was not actually going through the internet gateway, it did not have to be able to be intercepted. Again, I provide a copy of sort of a painful section from one of these reports talking about the fact that it really is the internet gateway only that they care about. There are other exemptions. If you're an internet carrier and you're connecting to another internet carrier, for example, at an exchange point, the FCC does not expect you to be able to intercept traffic there. So this is, again, a very big exception. And there's also sort of this fact that there's a last mile focus for a lot of what CALIA covers. The reason for that, a lot of the backbone carriers have no knowledge of whose traffic they're carrying. They would not be able to tell you who it is who's on a given IP address. They would not be able to go ahead and even tell you what MAC address is associated with a given bit of traffic. So the reality is that there's actually a lot of focus on the last mile provider, except there's actually an exemption for some of those folks too. The coffee shop exemption. They don't believe the folks who are running these little cyber cafes are either able or are going to be able to go ahead and provide the sort of lawful interception that they think that might be anticipated. So again, there's this sort of strange exemption of a group of folks. And you can see once again one of these footnotes. All the good stuff is always in the footnotes, and this is no exemption. So they're basically saying things like, well, schools or libraries might not need to go ahead and be intercepted. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of confusion as a result of all these exceptions, all these exemptions, all these things that maybe apply to you, maybe don't. And as a result, people have not been doing things like filing these monitoring reports or these system security and integrity plans and so forth. And this is sort of the best diagram I could come up with to kind of encapsulate this whole thing, which is, who in that sort of stack really is responsible for providing data to law enforcement? And the obvious choice of a statewide network or campus LAN might not be applicable based on some of the exemptions we've just talked about. So everyone, no one knows. That's really kind of the summary in terms of who's responsible for getting this data to law enforcement the way the law is currently written. And it's possible for all of these entities to instrument their networks to be ready if they're asked, but of course it's a tremendous financial burden that they simply don't want to undertake unless they have to. If you were to go ahead and do it far upstream, that can be in some ways very convenient, but it can be hard, especially if it's a high bandwidth pipe. Many of the state networks, again, have no ability to tell even whose traffic it is that they're going ahead and carrying from the downstream provider. And there may be millions of folks who are not even going to have traffic that even touches that internet gateway. If you go ahead and come down a little bit and come down to the campus level, again, you're still going to go ahead and have a lot of traffic that never touches that internet gateway. And I have another diagram that may go ahead and help illustrate this fact. It's usually referred to as hairpinning because something goes from one local user to another without going through that more protracted path through the interception point. But my point to you simply is that because of how things are set, you may find it doesn't actually go ahead and give the traffic that may be of interest to law enforcement. I mentioned peering very briefly before. Well, a lot of universities participate in peering. If you peer, that's an interconnection of one internet network with another. Again, exempt traffic. So you see where this whole paradigm starts to kind of break down. There are so many things exempted that a lot of the traffic that may be of interest may simply no longer go ahead and be intercepted. And we really haven't addressed even the fundamental issue of where does the internet begin? Is it where I pay someone to go ahead and carry my traffic? Well, again, if we think about peering, peering is a free service. It doesn't go ahead and involve the transfer of funds. If you think about things where administrative control changes from one hand to another, that can happen very early, even within a given campus. Things like network address blocks, well, those have some sort of strange properties in terms of how they may be allocated. Or even things like autonomous systems. You might have huge autonomous systems like AS701, UUNet, that go ahead and span millions of users. It would be silly to say that would be the correct point to require interception to occur. So the law really needs to be clarified to sort of fix that issue. The other thing I wanted to talk with you a little bit about was overcollection and the importance of sort of maintaining the privacy of the users who are not subject to an interception order. So when you go ahead and receive a lawful intercept order, it actually is something that requires you to only provide a given level of data. It might be pen-registered trap and trace data, essentially the equivalent of net flow, or it might be for full communication contents, the equivalent of sort of a packet capture. But you can't go ahead and provide more than folks actually require. You can only give them what they have been ordered to deliver. So as a result, if you had something specifying only interception of traffic for a particular IP address, you can't respond with that IP address's traffic and all the other traffic coming through a link. You can only go ahead and give them what was ordered. And they go ahead and have some very specific examples of what can be done to specify traffic. IP addresses, an account session ID. In some cases, it may not specify a person, it may specify equipment by a MAC address or again an IP address or a circuit ID. But the point is that you have to go ahead and do that sort of minimization, and it can be hard sometimes. If you have a firewall doing NAT, suddenly you may have a tremendous number of users who are behind a single IP address. And the result is that all that traffic may suddenly appear to be subject to this order, even though only a single individual may really be of interest. More recently, one of the things I've noticed is many campuses have NATs in front of a huge number of users. It's not unusual for a NAT to perhaps represent 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 users or even more. The result of that is that suddenly it becomes virtually impossible for law enforcement to go ahead and get just that sort of data, just the data for a particular person of interest. That architectural issue is a very profound one. Sometimes when there's no other way to go ahead and deal with this, it may be possible to do post hoc minimization. Collect all the data, then go ahead and just tease out the bits you want. But that's going to be very hard for law enforcement to do without the active collaboration of folks at the campus or state network level. Because again, remember, they're the only ones who are going to know who's on a given IP address, who's on a given subnet. There's also problems such as dynamic addressing and the problems of timestamps. In some cases, you might go ahead and be asked for data associated with a particular IP address, but as part of a DHCP pool. That address is going to turn over very rapidly, and unless you have accurate timestamps, there's a real risk that you might end up intercepting the wrong person. DHCP addresses obviously are very common in our community, and it's a sort of practical issue I'm not sure law enforcement has really given the sort of thought it deserves. Sometimes folks will connect without any authentication at all, and this just absolutely blows law enforcement's mind because they're used to having a very tight provider-customer relationship in the commercial world. But in the academic world, people will walk in, they'll jack into a wall jack that might be open in a classroom and use the network. Or in some cases, Columbia is a classic example, they would have free access to the network even for things like wireless. So when you start looking at those issues, it may no longer be possible to even do the sort of attribution that law enforcement might need. CALIA also has the potential to impact advanced protocols, and in this respect, higher education research and education networks differ tremendously from the commercial internet. CALIA is explicitly not supposed to discourage these advanced protocols. It's the sort of thing where everyone has realized these advanced protocols are crucial to the development of our economies and the delivery of innovative services. So let's look at a few of those and see how they fit with CALIA. IP multicast is perhaps the classic example. We heard from Kevin Almaroth this morning a little bit about IP multicast. I know many of you are familiar with it, so I won't stress that now. But it does provide a way for a shared pool of local users to use a network stream. It's not clear as you look at multicast whether or not it's possible to go ahead and suss out just IP multicast content that's being used by a subject of an intercept order. Sometimes there may be other participants who are also involved with a multicast session. It's going to be very hard to preserve their privacy while still capturing the data that the court requires. IPv6, another thing that truly is real. In the original version of this talk, I had a map that actually showed all the V6 connected sites. The federal government is going to have V6 required for all of their backbone networks here within less than a year, by 608. All the popular operating systems support V6. It's going to be something that will need to probably be tapped, but the reality is most folks don't have any sort of CALIA facility that's going to be able to handle that. If it handles native V6, it doesn't handle tunneling via something like Teredo. So when you start looking at V6, it really undermines the ability of law enforcement to go ahead and get the sort of data that they believe they need. Another example, jumbo frames. As we have the big fat pipes over long distances, we know that 1500 byte MTUs are not sufficient to go ahead and allow us to fill those pipes efficiently. Jumbo frames really facilitate that process. It's consistent with the government's recommendations, it's consistent with the recommendations of things like Internet 2 itself, and yet CALIA devices may not know how to talk or deal with jumbo frames on the LAN or the wide area. The standard for this kind of thing goes ahead and addresses fragmentation only very peripherally. And because jumbo frames are usually associated with high throughput connections, there are some very practical issues associated with dealing with that jumbo frame traffic as well. So when you go ahead and start looking at these sorts of issues, it's clear that these advanced facilities cause problems for CALIA. One other example, federated authentication. Many of you are familiar with Eduroam or some of the other InCommon and Shibboleth-based technologies. Those sorts of things basically allow folks to decouple authentication from identification. And essentially, you may be able to use a service with the service provider having no idea of your identity. So that kind of poses a problem. You may have access to a wireless network at a remote campus that may be authenticated, and yet there may be no way effectively for folks to go ahead and identify your usage as being the subject of a lawful interception order. So it kind of challenges the whole model that if I know enough to let you on, I also know enough to know whether I should go ahead and be intercepting traffic from you. Extreme data rates. We know higher education networks run at far faster speeds in many cases than the other folks out there in the commercial internet do. You know, 100 megabit connections, gigabit connections, very common. Speeds up to 10 gig on the wide area. So that's the sort of thing where those speeds really exceed what law enforcement can normally comfortably handle. A couple of excerpts from the DOJ report I mentioned before. There's not really very much of an emphasis on how data gets delivered. They talk about things like dial-out access or VPN or frame relay or T1s. Well, you know, T1s are not going to help you if someone is going ahead and running a hot 100 megabit connection from a dorm room. And the reality is that they need to probably scale up their expectations for the sorts of connections they need to be able to manage. But they don't want to pay for these fast connections. Even T1s become burdensome. They talk about how if they have 130 switches from one carrier, 95 from another, they're looking at nearly $300,000 just on install costs for these T1s. And it's not something where they feel the cost benefit really makes sense. There are other possibilities. These guys could do on-site or local wire rooms, or they could go ahead and even have something like a trailer that they go ahead and drive up to your network to go ahead and do this sort of intercept. But the reality is they probably are not going to want to do that. It, again, becomes very expensive. They may be able to tunnel this traffic back to central wire rooms or regional wire rooms. But that implies that there's excess capacity or the availability of some sort of dynamic tunneling facility that they're going to be able to accept. So I think the final bottom line really is that CALIA can and should be fixed. It deserves statutory cleanup. It's a 1994 law. A lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. It wasn't originally intended to apply to internet connections. I think it really deserves a little bit of cleanup. What's a private network? Where does the internet start? Who needs to go ahead and do this? And there are going to be times when it just can't be cleaned up. There are some things like encryption that simply are never going to be very amenable to interception. This is also something where there needs to be funding. So if you think about the original statute, it provided $500 million to the telephone companies to allow them to go ahead and do this CALIAification of their network. That money was all gone when it was extended to broadband providers. Now that the broadband providers are needing to become compliant, they're going to need funding as well. And so does law enforcement if they're going to take advantage of this capability. There's also the need for more time. So if you think about how much time the other folks have had, they're really, in many cases, only coming online with CALIA-capable switches for the telephone systems within the last year or two. And yet, in terms of broadband providers, the final judicial decision on this was only passed, what was it here now? I want to say a few months back, June 2006. And the technical specification only dates from April. So as a result, there's really not the same sort of time window that the telephone guys had that the broadband providers should also receive. And finally, I would think it's important that the statute actually begin to attack cybercrime. Remember, we've heard about 8 or 13 computer-related incidents potentially. That's not much utilization. Don't make us build out this expensive facility if it's not going to be used. Should it be used to attack trivial issues? No, but things like denial of service attacks that can be crippling to an entire domain or industry, or things like some of the spam kingpins who are running extremely sophisticated bot networks, I think those might be reasonable areas for it to be applied. So that's kind of my quick nutshell view of what you should be thinking about when it comes to CALIA, some of the disconnects that are out there. And I realize I probably have run over time, but fortunately other folks were very good. So I'd just like to thank you all for your patience and to thank some of the folks who went ahead and reviewed an earlier version of this. And if you have questions, happy to go ahead and talk with you about them now.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe.
Thank you.
Now, we have some questions.
And if you come up with questions later, too, I'm happy to talk to you by email or whatever. So, yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Andrew.
Thank you. I'll try not to drop it and scare everybody. Have you presented this to law enforcement and got any response from them?
I went ahead and shared it with some folks I happen to go ahead and know, and I've not received any formal comment from them, and I probably wouldn't expect to receive it as a result. But that's basically folks at the Department of Justice and some other folks as well. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. Thank you very much for all your attention this afternoon. I won't put up the slides. A comment that all of the papers and Joe's paper are on the website if people want them. There are papers from the other sessions as well. For the rest of the afternoon, we have